Chapter 4. Tim turned onto their street. For one brief moment, everything looked normal. The row of familiar houses stood exactly where they always had. Children's toys rested in front yards. Mailboxes lined the curb. The old maple tree across the street swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. Then the smell hit. Smoke. Much stronger now. A thick, bitter odor rolled through the truck even with the windows closed. Tim slowed. The dark plume they'd been following all afternoon rose only a few blocks away. Several neighbors stood in their driveways staring in the same direction. No one talked. No one smiled. Everyone simply watched. "That's close," Helena whispered. "Too close," Tim answered. He pulled into their driveway. Home. For the first time all day, he expected relief. Instead, the silence felt wrong. Their house looked untouched. The lawn still needed mowing. The flower bed Helena had planted in the spring bloomed beneath the front windows. The porch swing moved gently in the breeze. Everything was exactly as they had left it. Except their next-door neighbor's garage door stood wide open. Tools lay scattered across the driveway. A bicycle rested on its side. No one was outside. Tim shut off the engine. Nobody move yet. He listened. No birds. No dogs barking. No lawnmowers. No distant children laughing. Only the faint wail of sirens somewhere across the city. Odin let out another low growl. His eyes remained fixed toward the end of the block. Tim reached back and rested a hand on the dog's shoulder. "Easy." The growl didn't stop. Helena looked at him. "You feel it too?" "Yeah. Something's off." He climbed out of the truck. The afternoon heat wrapped around him immediately. Smoke drifted between the houses. Ash floated lazily through the air like gray snowflakes. Tim opened the rear door. "Stay here for a minute. I'll unlock the house." Timmy climbed out anyway. "I'll help." Tim hesitated. "Stay close." "Always." Together they walked toward the front porch. Tim unlocked the front door. The familiar scent of home drifted out. Everything inside looked exactly as they had left it. No broken windows. No signs of forced entry. Power still worked. He flipped on the entryway light. Nothing. Power didn't work. Great. Helena stepped inside with Lily. "At least it's still here," she said quietly. Tim nodded. "Start getting the coolers inside before the food warms up." Timmy carried the first cooler through the front door. Lily hugged her blanket and looked nervously out the front window. Odin refused to enter. Instead, he stood on the porch staring toward the street. "What's he looking at?" Tim asked. The German shepherd's ears stood rigid. A deep growl rumbled from his chest. Then someone shouted, "Help!" The voice echoed from farther down the block. "Help, there's a person hurt." Tim spun toward the sound to see a neighbor rushing towards a bloody man. One older couple froze on their porch. Another man hurried toward the injured stranger. Tim instinctively started forward. Helena grabbed his arm. "Tim. He's hurt." "I know." "Wait. Something isn't?" A scream cut her off. The man running to help had reached the injured stranger. Instead of collapsing into his arms, the injured man lunged. They crashed to the pavement. For an instant, it looked like two people wrestling. Then the screaming started. Raw. Terrified. The injured stranger buried his face against the other man's shoulder. Tim frowned. "What the?" Blood sprayed across the sidewalk. Someone yelled. "Get him off." Another neighbor ran forward. A woman screamed from a nearby porch. The attacker never stopped. He didn't punch. He didn't wrestle. He bit him. Tim stood frozen. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. That's impossible. The second neighbor grabbed the attacker's shoulders and pulled with all his strength. The attacker released his victim. Not because he'd been forced to. Because he'd chosen to. He turned. Slowly. His face was covered in blood. His mouth hung unnaturally open. One eye stared in a different direction than the other. For a heartbeat. Everything became perfectly still. Then the attacker charged the second man. Not with anger. Not with purpose. With something far worse. Pure instinct. Run. Someone screamed. The quiet neighborhood exploded into chaos. People slammed front doors. Children cried. A woman dragged her husband backward by his shirt. The second man barely avoided the attack, stumbling into the street as the blood-covered stranger clawed wildly at him. Tim finally moved. Inside. Now. Helena didn't argue. She grabbed Lily's hand. Timmy whistled sharply. Odin. The German shepherd sprinted toward the house. Tim shoved everyone through the front door. He slammed it shut behind them. The deadbolt clicked into place. For several seconds, no one breathed. Outside, screams echoed somewhere down the street. Then another. Then another. Tim stared through the narrow window beside the front door. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it. Whatever they had just witnessed. It wasn't a riot. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't anything he had ever imagined possible. The world had changed. And it had arrived on their doorstep. The deadbolt clicked into place. Tim didn't move. His hand remained wrapped around the doorknob as he stared through the narrow window beside the front door. Outside. The quiet suburban street had dissolved into confusion. People shouted from porches. Car doors slammed. A child cried somewhere down the block. The injured man who had been attacked lay motionless on the pavement. The blood-covered attacker was gone. Where he had gone, Tim couldn't tell. Tim? Helena's voice was barely above a whisper. He turned. Lily clung tightly to her mother, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Timmy stood near the living room window, carefully pulling one corner of the curtain aside. Odin remained between the family and the front door. The German shepherd's lips curled back just enough to reveal his teeth. His growl hadn't stopped. What? What was that? Lily asked. Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. Tim finally spoke. Lock every door. Every window. Timmy nodded immediately. Already on it. He disappeared down the hallway. Helena took Lily toward the kitchen. Come on. Let's stay away from the windows. Tim followed, checking each lock as he passed. Front windows. Locked. Back door. Locked. Sliding glass door. Locked. He drew every curtain closed. The house suddenly felt darker. Smaller. Safer. Or so he hoped. Timmy returned a minute later. Everything's locked. Garage too. Good. Tim looked toward the television. Let's see if somebody finally knows what's going on. He grabbed the remote and pressed the power button. Nothing. Right. Power's still out. He tried the battery-powered camping lantern instead. Soft white light filled the living room. Better than nothing. Helena placed the cooler beside the kitchen island. The food can wait. Tim agreed. Everyone sat down. Nobody relaxed. The silence lasted nearly a minute. Finally Timmy broke it. That guy. He bit him. Tim nodded slowly. Yeah. I've never. He couldn't finish the sentence. Neither had anyone else. Helena folded her arms tightly across her chest. Drugs? Some kind of mental breakdown? Maybe. Tim answered. Though the explanation felt hollow. People didn't act like that. Not like whatever they'd just seen. A loud bang echoed from somewhere outside. Lily jumped. Odin barked once. Just once. Then returned to growling. Tim walked carefully to the front window and lifted the curtain less than an inch. Across the street, several neighbors hurried boxes into the back of an SUV. The father looked over his shoulder every few seconds. His wife buckled two small children into the back seat with trembling hands. They weren't packing for a vacation. They were fleeing. The SUV sped away before the rear hatch was fully closed. Tim let the curtain fall. People are leaving. Helena looked up. Should we? He didn't answer immediately. Home had always been the safest place. But after what they'd just witnessed, he wasn't certain anymore. Before he could respond, the familiar tone of an emergency alert sounded from somewhere inside the house. Everyone froze. The sound came from a small battery-powered weather radio sitting on a shelf near the kitchen. Tim hurried over and switched it on. Static filled the room. Then, a strange voice emerged. Washington State Emergency Management advises all residents to remain indoors. The signal crackled. Avoid contact with individuals displaying. Static swallowed the description. Violent or irrational behavior. The radio hissed loudly. Law enforcement and emergency medical services are experiencing more static. Delays. The signal returned briefly. Secure your residence. Stay away from crowds. Then silence. Only static remained. Tim slowly lowered the radio. Violent behavior. Timmy repeated. That's putting it lightly. Helena looked toward the front door. They didn't say what was causing it. No. Tim answered. But they told everyone to stay inside. Another scream echoed outside. Closer this time. Then came the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. Lily buried her face against Helena's shoulder. I want this to stop. Helena gently stroked her hair. I know, sweetheart. I know. Tim returned to the window. A delivery van sat sideways across the street. Its driver's door stood open. No driver. One of the neighbors from farther down the block sprinted past the house carrying a baseball bat. He looked terrified. He disappeared around the corner toward the screams. Moments later. Another scream. Then silence. Tim closed the curtain completely. Nobody goes outside. Not for any reason. Even if someone asks for help? Timmy asked. Tim looked at his son. The question hurt. Because every instinct he had screamed to help people. But he'd just watched a man nearly die trying to do exactly that. Not until we know what's happening. He finally said. Our job is to keep this family alive. Helena reached across the table and squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. For the first time since turning onto their street. They weren't thinking about unpacking. Or dinner. Or returning to work tomorrow. Those things belonged to yesterday. Outside, another siren wailed. Then another. Somewhere in the distance. A gunshot cracked through the afternoon air. It was followed by two more. The neighborhood fell eerily quiet. Tim looked around the room. At Helena. At Timmy. At Lily. At Odin standing watch near the front door. Whatever was happening outside, it wasn't ending. It was spreading. And for the first time since leaving the campground, Tim accepted a terrifying possibility. They might not be safe anywhere. The house settled into an uneasy silence. Not the comforting silence of home. This one felt fragile, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Tim checked the front door one more time. Locked. Deadbolt engaged. He pulled on the handle anyway. It didn't move. Good. Helena carried the camping cooler into the kitchen. The ice had already begun to melt. At least we've got food for a few days, she said. Tim nodded. Maybe longer if we're careful. Timmy opened the pantry. Canned soup. Pasta. Rice. Peanut butter. He counted quietly. We've got enough for a while. Water? Helena asked. Tim walked to the garage and returned with 3 unopened cases of bottled water from a warehouse sale months earlier. 48 bottles. Plus whatever's in the water heater if we need it. Timmy looked surprised. You planned for this? Tim smiled weakly. I planned for storms. Power outages. Earthquakes. Not. He couldn't finish the thought. Nobody could. Odin suddenly stood. His ears snapped forward. The growl returned. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the front door. Everyone froze. Another knock. Louder. Tim slowly approached the window beside the door. Who is it? It's Carl. Please. Please open up. Tim recognized the voice immediately. Carl Jensen lived 2 houses down. Retired firefighter. 70 years old. He and his wife Margaret had lived on the street longer than anyone. Tim cracked the curtain just enough to see. Carl stood alone on the porch. His gray hair was matted with sweat. One sleeve of his flannel shirt had been torn open. There was blood on the fabric. Carl held both hands where Tim could see them. I'm alone. Margaret's gone. I don't know where she is. Please. Tim looked closer. The blood wasn't flowing. It had dried. His arm. It was scraped. Not bitten. At least. It didn't appear to be. Helena stepped beside him. It's Carl. I know. He's hurt. Tim hesitated. Every instinct told him to help. Another instinct, the one that had kept his family alive all afternoon, told him to keep the door shut. Carl spoke again. They're attacking people. I don't know why. Please. I don't want to be alone. Tim looked back at his family. Helena gave a small nod. He's our neighbor. Tim slowly unlocked the deadbolt. The door opened just wide enough for Carl to slip inside. Tim locked it again immediately. Carl leaned heavily against the wall. Thank you. His hands shook violently. Helena handed him a bottle of water. Drink. He emptied half of it without stopping. What happened? Tim asked. Carl stared at the floor for several seconds. At first, we thought it was people fighting. Then, he swallowed hard. I watched a woman get hit by a car. She got back up. Started attacking the driver. People tried pulling her away. She bit one of them. Carl rubbed his face. Then the man she bit started doing the same thing. The room fell silent. Timmy finally spoke. You're saying it spread? Carl looked at him with tired eyes. I don't know. I just know every person who got bitten changed. Nobody argued. Nobody laughed at how impossible it sounded. They had all seen enough to know that impossible things were happening. The weather radio crackled again. Static filled the room before another emergency message broke through. Governor has activated the National Guard statewide. Citizens are instructed to remain inside secured buildings. Avoid physical contact with injured individuals. The signal faded. Then briefly returned. Do not attempt. Static. Repeat. Do not attempt to transport injured persons unless directed by emergency officials. The transmission disappeared once more. Carl looked toward the radio. They know. Tim nodded. They just don't know how to stop it. A loud crash echoed from somewhere outside. Everyone instinctively ducked. Another crash followed. Then glass breaking. Tim moved carefully to the front window. Across the street, the Henderson family's garage door hung halfway open. Their SUV backed out so quickly it clipped the mailbox, knocking it onto the lawn. The driver never stopped. The vehicle accelerated down the street. Halfway to the corner, it swerved violently. A man stumbled into the road. The SUV narrowly missed him before disappearing around the bend. The man didn't even seem to notice. He wandered aimlessly for several seconds. Then turned toward another house. His clothes were stained with blood. One arm hung at an unnatural angle. He began pounding both fists against the front door. Slowly. Methodically. Boom. 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 No shouting. No pleading. Just relentless pounding. Odin barked furiously. The man stopped. His head turned. Very slowly. Toward Tim's house. Toward Odin. Tim's stomach tightened. The stranger stood perfectly still. As if listening. Then. He took one slow step toward their yard. Another. Then another. Tim lowered the curtain. Everyone. Stay away from the windows. Nobody argued. Outside. The steady pounding continued. Only now. It was getting closer. The house fell silent. No one dared speak above a whisper. Outside. Footsteps scraped softly across the sidewalk. Slow. Uneven. Drawing closer. Tim motioned everyone away from the front of the house. Living room. Stay low. Helena guided Lily behind the couch. Carl sank carefully into an armchair, still clutching the half-empty bottle of water with trembling hands. Timmy moved beside his father. What do we do? We don't let whatever that is know we're here. Tim whispered. Odin stood rigid at the edge of the hallway. Every muscle in his body was tense. His eyes never left the front door. The scraping stopped. For several long seconds. Nothing. Tim held his breath. Maybe it kept? Thunk. Something struck the front porch. Not hard. Just enough to make everyone jump. Another step. Closer. Then. A slow creak. The porch boards. Someone was standing directly outside the front door. Lily buried her face against Helena's shoulder. Helena wrapped both arms around her daughter, gently stroking her hair. It's okay. We're together. Tim wished he believed those words as much as he wanted Lily to. A shadow drifted across the frosted glass beside the door. Human. Standing perfectly still. Waiting. Thunk. A hand touched the door. Not pounding. Not forcing it. Just feeling it. Tim slowly crept toward the narrow window beside the entrance. He raised one corner of the curtain no more than an inch. The man from across the street stood on the porch. Up close, he looked far worse. His skin had taken on a pale gray tone. Blood covered his chin and shirt. His left arm dangled uselessly at his side. His eyes. Tim's stomach tightened. They were open. But empty. Not confused. Not frightened. Just vacant. The man tilted his head slightly. Almost like he was listening. Then he sniffed the air. Tim let the curtain fall immediately. "He's here," Carl whispered. Tim nodded once. The stranger remained motionless. 30 seconds. A minute. 2. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound inside the house was the soft hum of the camping lantern. Then. Scratch. Fingernails dragged slowly across the front door. Not enough to damage it. Just enough to make the hairs on the back of Tim's neck stand up. Scratch. 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 Lily squeezed her eyes shut. "Make him go away," she whispered. Nobody knew how. Odin released another low growl. Tim reached down and gently rested a hand on the dog's neck. "Easy." The growl softened but didn't stop. Outside, the scratching ceased. Another long silence. Then footsteps. Moving away. Tim waited another full minute before risking another glance. The porch was empty. He slowly exhaled. "He's gone." No sooner had the words left his mouth than Carl shook his head. "No. He's looking for another way in." The realization hit everyone at once. The back door. The windows. The garage. Tim looked at Timmy. "Let's check everything." Quietly. The two of them moved through the house with flashlights. Every window. Locked. Every curtain closed. The sliding glass door. Locked with a wooden dowel in the track. Garage side door. Locked. Tim pulled a heavy workbench against it anyway. Couldn't hurt. Back in the kitchen, Timmy looked out through the smallest gap in the blinds overlooking the backyard. "Dad." Tim joined him. The backyard was empty. The fence gate hung open. "I know I latched that before we left," Tim said. Helena looked up. "Could the wind?" "No. That latch doesn't open by itself." He quietly stepped into the garage and retrieved a hammer. Not as a weapon. As a tool. He found a length of scrap lumber and several long screws in a storage bin. Timmy immediately understood. Barricades. Just enough to slow someone down. Exactly. Working carefully to avoid making unnecessary noise, they reinforced the sliding glass door and the gate leading from the garage into the house. It wouldn't stop someone determined forever. But it might buy precious seconds. When they finished, Tim laid the hammer on the kitchen counter within easy reach. Carl watched them. "You think they'll keep coming?" Tim paused. He thought about the man on the porch. The empty eyes. The slow, deliberate movements. The way he had stopped when Odin growled. "I think." He chose his words carefully. "I think they're looking for people." The room grew quiet again. As if to answer him. A distant scream echoed through the neighborhood. Another followed. Then barking dogs. Car horns. Somewhere farther away. A rapid series of gunshots cracked through the afternoon air. Silence returned just as quickly. The family looked at one another. No one needed to say it aloud. The nightmare outside wasn't getting smaller. It was spreading from house to house. And eventually, it would reach every door on the street. Late afternoon slowly gave way to evening. The sunlight filtering through the edges of the curtains turned from bright white to a muted orange. Inside the house, the family finally had a moment to breathe. Not relax. Just Breathe. Tim stood in the center of the living room. Everyone okay? A chorus of quiet nods answered him. Good. Let's figure out what we've got before we do anything else. Timmy grabbed a notepad from the kitchen drawer. Inventory? Exactly. If we're staying here, we need to know what we're working with. Helena opened the pantry while Tim and Timmy disappeared into the garage. Carl remained seated near the front window, listening for anything outside. Lily stayed beside Odin on the living room floor, gently stroking his fur. The German shepherd finally stopped growling. Instead, he watched every doorway in the house. Waiting. Tim switched on a battery lantern inside the garage. Rows of shelves lined the walls. Years of weekend projects filled plastic bins and pegboards. He looked around with new eyes. Not as a homeowner. As someone preparing to survive. Timmy flipped open the notebook. Okay. Where do we start? Water. Tim answered. They counted the cases stacked against the wall. 3 unopened cases. 48 bottles. Plus another dozen loose bottles left over from previous camping trips. The water heater. Tim added. That's another 40 gallons if we have to drain it. Timmy scribbled everything down. Food next. Back inside, Helena had already emptied the pantry onto the kitchen counter. Canned vegetables. Soup. Beans. Fruit. Boxes of pasta. Rice. Flour. Sugar. Peanut butter. Oatmeal. Enough frozen meat remained in the powerless freezer to last another day or two if they cooked it quickly. Longer if they found a way to keep it cold. We've got maybe 2 weeks? Helena guessed. 3 if we're careful. Tim nodded. Long enough to avoid joining the crowds. Carl quietly spoke from the dining room. That's assuming the stores ever open again. Nobody answered. The possibility lingered over the room. Tim returned to the garage. Flashlights. Batteries. Extension cords. Portable propane stove. Camping cookware. First aid kits. Rope. Tarps. Duct tape. Fire extinguishers. It wasn't a survival bunker. But it was a good start. Then he opened the gun safe. Inside rested the firearms he'd owned for years. A 12-gauge shotgun. A hunting rifle. A small handgun. Several locked ammunition boxes sat neatly on the bottom shelf. Tim looked at them for a long moment. He'd always hoped they'd never be needed for anything beyond hunting or home defense. Now, he wasn't sure what home defense even meant anymore. Timmy stood beside him. Think we'll need them? I hope not. Tim replied honestly. But hoping isn't enough anymore. He removed the safe's contents and carried them into the house. Helena looked uneasy. You really think it's come to this? Tim placed the firearms on the dining room table. I think I'd rather have them and never use them than need them once. She slowly nodded. I can't argue with that. Tim checked each firearm carefully before locking them away again in a cabinet only he and Helena could access. The ammunition remained stored separately. For now. Lily looked up from the floor. Are bad people coming here? Tim knelt beside her. I don't know. Then why are we locking everything? He smiled gently. Because when things are confusing, the smartest thing we can do is be prepared. She seemed to accept that answer. Odin rested his head against her shoulder. The weather radio crackled again. Static. Then a voice. Emergency services remain overwhelmed. Citizens should avoid all unnecessary travel. National Guard units continue establishing. Static consumed the rest. Tim switched the volume lower. Same message. Different words. Carl rubbed his tired eyes. Nobody's saying when it'll end. Because they probably don't know. Helena answered quietly. Outside. A car horn blared continuously somewhere several streets away. It didn't stop. Minutes passed. The horn continued. Eventually another joined it. Then another. The sounds echoed across the neighborhood like distant alarms. Tim walked carefully to the kitchen window. The street remained empty. No children. No neighbors chatting. No joggers. Only abandoned bicycles lying in driveways. Trash cans tipped onto their sides. A newspaper fluttering across the asphalt. The ordinary rhythm of suburban life had vanished. As the sun dipped lower, long shadows stretched across the front yard. Darkness would arrive within the hour. Tim looked around at his family. Tonight. Nobody sleeps alone. We'll take turns staying awake. Timmy nodded immediately. I'll take first watch with you. Carl slowly stood. Make it 3. I've spent 30 years sleeping lightly. Might as well put it to good use. Tim smiled faintly. Appreciate it. Helena began gathering blankets from the hallway closet. We'll all stay downstairs. Safer if we stay together. No one argued. The upstairs bedroom suddenly felt too far away. Too isolated. Too difficult to reach if something happened. As the last light of day faded beyond the closed curtains, the house grew quiet once more. Outside. The city did not. Sirens continued to echo in the distance. Helicopters still crossed overhead. Occasionally, a scream carried through the evening air. Each one reminded them that somewhere beyond the walls of their home, another family was facing the same nightmare. And for the first time, Tim understood a simple, terrifying truth. Surviving the day had been the easy part. Now they had to survive the night. Darkness settled over the neighborhood with surprising speed. Without street lights. Without porch lights. Without the glow of televisions behind living room windows. The familiar subdivision became almost unrecognizable. Only the orange glow of distant fires painted the low clouds. Every few minutes another flicker appeared somewhere across the city. A new fire. Or an old one growing larger. Tim couldn't tell. He sat in a dining room chair pulled beside the front window. The curtain remained almost completely closed. Only the smallest gap allowed him to watch the street. Timmy sat nearby with a flashlight switched off in his lap. Carl occupied the recliner near the hallway, listening more than watching. The rest of the house had gone quiet. Helena had finally convinced Lily to lie down on a pile of blankets in the living room. The little girl fell asleep with one hand resting against Odin's shoulder. The German shepherd never closed his eyes. He simply watched the front door. Waiting. Listening. The weather radio hissed quietly on the kitchen counter. No broadcasts. Only static. Tim checked his watch. 9:42 p.m. It somehow felt much later. Nobody realized how much noise a neighborhood normally made until it disappeared. No passing cars. No televisions. No laughter drifting from open windows. Not even crickets. The silence felt wrong. Then, a dog barked. Far away. Another answered. Then several more. The barking grew louder for a few seconds before abruptly stopping. Every dog. At exactly the same time. Carl slowly looked toward Tim. That's not normal. No. It wasn't. Several minutes later. Footsteps echoed somewhere outside. Not running. Walking. Slowly. Dragging slightly against the pavement. Scrape. Step. Scrape. Step. The sound passed the house. Continued down the street. Then faded into the darkness. Nobody breathed until it disappeared. Tim slowly lowered the corner of the curtain. A lone figure shuffled beneath the glow of a distant fire. Its clothes hung in tatters. One arm swung awkwardly at its side. Its head turned slowly from house to house. Not searching with purpose. Searching with instinct. The figure stopped in front of a house 3 doors away. It stood perfectly still. Listening. Then it wandered on. Tim let the curtain fall. Still out there? Timmy whispered. Yeah. Just one. Carl rubbed his chin. 1 becomes 2. 2 become 20. I've seen enough hunting coyotes to know how predators work. Tim nodded. Let's hope these things aren't that smart. The words barely left his mouth before a scream shattered the night. It came from somewhere several blocks away. High. Desperate. It lasted only seconds. Then gunshots. 5. Maybe 6. Silence returned. Lily stirred in her sleep but didn't wake. Helena opened her eyes from the couch. What happened? Tim quietly shook his head. Too far away. The silence stretched on. Minutes passed. Then another sound. Metal striking metal. Clang. 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 Someone was pounding on something. Not nearby. Perhaps at the end of the street. The rhythm continued for nearly a minute. Then stopped abruptly. Carl frowned. Trying to get someone's attention. Or scare something away. Tim answered. Neither possibility was comforting. Odin suddenly stood. Every muscle tightened. His ears pointed toward the backyard. A low growl rolled from deep inside his chest. Tim slowly reached for the hammer resting beside his chair. He motioned toward Timmy. Back door. Quietly. The two of them moved through the darkened house without switching on a flashlight. Moonlight filtered faintly through the covered windows. Just enough to navigate. Tim paused beside the sliding glass door. Nothing. The backyard looked empty. The fence cast long shadows across the grass. Then. A faint rattle. The wooden gate. Someone. Or something. Had touched it. Tim waited. Another soft rattle. Followed by silence. He listened for nearly a full minute. Nothing else. Probably the wind. Timmy whispered. Tim looked toward the still trees outside. There wasn't enough wind to move a leaf. Neither of them said another word. They returned to the living room. Carl immediately saw the expression on Tim's face. Backyard? Tim nodded once. Something checked the gate. The older man sighed heavily. They're wandering. Looking. The thought settled over the room like another blanket. No coordinated attack. No plan. Just relentless searching. That somehow felt worse. The weather radio crackled to life again. Everyone looked toward the kitchen. This is an emergency message. Static. Remain inside. Do not respond to. The transmission dissolved into loud bursts of interference. Tim turned the volume down. Whatever came after those words. They never heard it. Near midnight, Helena quietly relieved Carl for a few minutes so he could stretch his legs. She poured everyone fresh water. No one felt hungry. The food remained untouched on the kitchen counter. Fear had a way of silencing empty stomachs. Midnight came. Then 1 o'clock. The fires outside continued to glow against the clouds. Occasionally another siren wailed in the distance. Each one seemed farther away than the last. Tim wasn't sure whether emergency crews were finally gaining control, or whether there was simply no one left to answer the calls. He glanced around the room. His wife. His children. Carl. Odin. Everything that mattered in his world sat inside these four walls. Outside, the world was changing by the hour. Inside, their only goal was simple: see the sunrise. Tim wasn't sure when midnight became 2 in the morning. Time had slowed. Every minute seemed to last an hour. The house remained dark except for the faint glow of the camping lantern turned down as low as possible. Timmy rubbed his tired eyes. "You should try to sleep," Tim whispered. "I'm not tired." Tim smiled faintly. "You're exhausted." "A little." "Go lie down. Wake me if you hear anything." Timmy hesitated before finally nodding. He stretched out beside Lily on the pile of blankets. Within minutes, exhaustion won. His breathing settled into a slow rhythm. Tim envied him. Sleep felt impossible. Outside, the neighborhood remained unnaturally still. Not peaceful. Waiting. Then, a porch light blinked on across the street. Tim frowned. Someone must have started a generator. The light illuminated the Henderson family's front porch. Mr. Henderson stepped outside carrying a flashlight and a baseball bat. He swept the flashlight across his yard. Across the sidewalk. Toward the street. "What are you doing?" Tim whispered. The answer came seconds later. A frantic pounding erupted from farther down the block. Bang. 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 "Help. Please. Open the door." The desperate voice echoed through the sleeping neighborhood. Another voice answered. "Go away. Please. They're coming." Glass shattered somewhere nearby. The screaming grew louder. Mr. Henderson froze on his porch. His flashlight swung wildly toward the sound. "No. Go back inside," Tim muttered under his breath. Instead, the man stepped off the porch and into the street. The pounding continued. Another neighbor opened their front door. Then another. People emerged from homes, trying to understand what was happening. Curiosity. Compassion. Confusion. Exactly the things that made good people vulnerable. A figure sprinted around the corner. At first, Tim thought it was the person calling for help. Then the streetlight caught him. His clothes were torn. His face was streaked with blood. He wasn't running away. He was chasing. Behind him came another figure. Then another. They weren't shouting. They weren't calling for help. They simply ran. Fast. Much faster than the shambling man Tim had seen earlier that evening. Carl quietly joined Tim at the window. "Dear God." The first runner reached the man pounding on a front door. He tackled him to the pavement. The screams stopped almost immediately. The other figures piled onto them. Mr. Henderson stood frozen in the middle of the street. "Run!" Carl shouted before catching himself. The words never left the house. Outside, Mr. Henderson finally turned. He sprinted toward his porch. He almost made it. One of the attackers grabbed the back of his shirt. The fabric tore. He stumbled onto the steps. His wife threw the front door open. "Come on." He dove inside. She slammed the door. A second later, something crashed against it from the outside. Then another impact. Then another. The attackers pounded with unbelievable force. The entire door shook. Inside Tim's house, no one spoke. They listened. Wood splintered. Someone screamed inside the Henderson home. Furniture scraped across the floor. They're barricading it, Helena whispered from behind them. Tim hadn't realized she was awake. He nodded without taking his eyes off the window. The pounding lasted nearly a minute. Then stopped. The attackers wandered away. Just walked away. As though whatever had drawn them there was gone. Mr. Henderson's porch light still burned. The front door hung crookedly on broken hinges. No one emerged. No one called for help. Only silence remained. Tim slowly lowered the curtain. They're attracted to noise, Carl said quietly. Tim looked at him. The yelling. The flashlight. The pounding. Everything kept bringing more of them. Helena wrapped her arms around herself. So if we stay quiet, maybe they keep moving. Maybe, Carl answered. Or maybe they eventually find every house anyway. No one wanted to think about that. Lily stirred awake. Is it morning? Not yet, Helena answered gently. Go back to sleep. Lily nodded sleepily and curled closer to Odin. The German shepherd remained awake. Always awake. Tim walked quietly into the kitchen. He unfolded a paper map of Spokane across the table. Several routes led east. Toward Helena's mother's farm. Toward open country. Toward somewhere with fewer people. Yesterday, leaving home had never crossed his mind. Tonight. He traced the roads with one finger. He wasn't planning an errand anymore. He was planning an escape. Because one terrible truth had become impossible to ignore. The neighborhood wasn't recovering. It was being consumed. One house at a time. One family at a time. Sooner or later, their turn would come. Chapter 4-8, Leaving Home. Tim didn't realize he'd drifted asleep until Odin nudged his hand. The German shepherd stood beside him, ears forward. Not growling. Listening. Gray morning light seeped around the edges of the curtains. Dawn. The longest night of Tim's life had finally ended. No one celebrated. Helena was already awake, quietly heating water on the small propane stove for instant coffee. The smell filled the kitchen. Normally, it meant the beginning of another ordinary day. Today, it simply reminded them they were still alive. Carl stood at the front window. You should see this. Tim joined him. He carefully lifted the curtain no more than half an inch. The neighborhood looked abandoned. Several front doors stood open. A pickup truck sat crooked across the street, one tire resting on a curb. The Hendersons' porch was splintered. Their front door hung from a single hinge. No movement came from inside. The paperboys' newspapers lay scattered across driveways. Nobody had picked them up. The silence was almost complete. Where is everyone? Timmy asked quietly. Tim didn't answer. A slow movement caught his eye. At the far end of the street, a lone figure wandered between parked cars. Then another stepped from behind a mailbox. A woman in a torn bathrobe shuffled across a front lawn. An older man limped slowly down the sidewalk. None of them spoke. None of them looked at one another. They simply wandered. Searching. How many? Helena whispered. Too many. Tim answered. Another figure emerged from behind a minivan. Then another. The street they had lived on for nearly 12 years no longer belonged to the families who called it home. It belonged to the infected. Carl quietly stepped back from the window. If they're already this thick here, the city's finished. Nobody argued. The weather radio crackled once again. The signal was weaker than ever. Federal emergency declaration. Static. National Guard. Evacuation routes. The transmission broke apart. A new voice briefly cut through the interference. Do not attempt to travel through. Static swallowed the destination. Then. Silence. The radio never came back. Tim switched it off. Either the batteries had finally died. Or the station had. He wasn't sure which thought bothered him more. Helena spread the road map across the kitchen table. If we're leaving, we need to go before more of them wake up. Tim nodded. Every hour we wait makes getting out harder. Timmy looked toward the front window. We're really leaving? Tim looked around the room. The family photographs. The couch where they'd watched countless movies together. Lily's drawings hanging proudly on the refrigerator. The hallway with pencil marks recording the children's heights over the years. Every birthday. Every Christmas. Every ordinary Tuesday evening. Their life filled these walls. He had spent years fixing things. Painting rooms. Planting trees. Building shelves in the garage. This wasn't just a house. It was home. Helena quietly reached for his hand. We can build another home, she said softly. Not another family. Tim closed his eyes for a moment. She was right. The house had protected them for one night. It might not protect them through another. He opened his eyes. We're leaving. The words hurt more than he expected. No one questioned the decision. They simply began moving. Tim and Timmy filled backpacks with food that would travel well. Canned goods. Peanut butter. Trail mix. Energy bars left over from camping. Helena packed clothing, blankets, medications, important documents, and family photographs into plastic bins. Lily carefully placed her dragon-shaped driftwood into her backpack. She looked around her bedroom one last time. Do I have to leave my stuffed animals? Helena knelt beside her. Take your favorite. We'll come back for the others someday. Lily hugged a worn brown teddy bear before placing it beside the driftwood. Odin paced between family members, sensing the urgency. Carl packed almost nothing. A change of clothes. A framed photograph of Margaret. His wedding ring. That's all that's left, he said quietly. Tim placed a hand on the older man's shoulder. You don't have to go through this alone. Carl gave a tired nod. Thank you. The truck sat waiting in the driveway. Half a tank of fuel. Camping gear already loaded. It was as ready as it was ever going to be. Tim opened the garage door just enough to look outside. The sound of the motor seemed impossibly loud. He froze. Across the street, one of the wandering figures stopped. Its head turned. Then another. And another. 3 pairs of vacant eyes fixed on the partially opened garage. Tim slowly lowered the door again. The infected drifted closer. Not running. Not yet. But they had noticed. Tim turned toward his family. His voice remained calm. We leave now. Everyone understood. There would be no second chance. Tim unlocked the door leading into the garage. Timmy gripped the handle of the first supply bin. Helena held Lily's hand. Carl stood ready beside them. Odin waited at the front of the group, muscles tense. Tim took one last look at the place where his children had grown up. Goodbye, he whispered. Then he opened the garage door. Morning sunlight flooded inside. The infected lifted their heads. And the race to survive truly began.